Welcome to Standard Deviation.
Hello, Ciara.
Hey, Kevin, how's it going?
Oh, it's going. I feel like such a phony. We just started recording. We started recording and then the batteries died on our thing, and now we're starting over ostensibly as if it had never happened, but I've gone and blown that.
Clearly not.
I feel fake. I feel like this is scripted now.
It was less
I don't
than
know who I am.
We were only less than 3 minutes in, so I was like, let's just start over.
Yeah, I guess. Nice sweater.
Oh, thanks. It has Cthulhu on it.
Yeah, you like to get high and buy sweaters online and then forget about it.
Hey, come on. Let's tell the real story.
It's taking the steam out. I feel like
Kevin is correct. My favorite thing is to get high, buy things online, and then a week later find out what I bought myself.
Wow, that's cool. How
Yeah.
original. I've never heard that before.
You know what? There's more than just you listening to me right now, or when I post this.
Yeah, I guess. Anyways.
Anyways.
It is June 3rd, 2020. And for those listening from the future, or from another galaxy, or from the same galaxy, it's pretty big.
Yeah, there's a lot of room. In case you've been living under an asteroid.
Yeah.
See what I did there?
Yeah. How is there an under to an asteroid?
I don't know.
It's like every direction is up or down. Anyway, it is, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, which has been going on since, officially, I think, since March. I think the outbreak started just December-ish, something like that.
Yeah, been in lockdown basically since March.
Yeah, and also in the middle of international protesting and rioting over the George Floyd case.
Mm-hmm.
George Floyd was a black man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who was accused of trying to pass a fraudulent bill, like a $20.
Yeah.
So the police were called from a store, and they detained him and then held him to the ground and leaned on him with their knees in his neck and back for about 8 minutes until he died.
Yes.
And so they've been charged with murder. The primary officer was charged with second-degree murder, and the other three just today were charged with aiding and abetting homicide, I believe. Mm-hmm. So that's good. Good that they were charged. And this has sparked, I think, unprecedented rioting and protests.
Yeah, I think, was it yesterday we found out that all 50 states had protests at least?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. It's interesting. And the issue of police brutality and race in America is important by itself. And it's also concerning that when the pandemic started and the lockdown started and the economic impacts started, I was concerned that we would see large-scale rioting eventually. Just because people get... I mean, the only reason we don't see wide-scale rioting and crime every day, I think, is because society more or less functions. Yeah. There's equilibrium at the very least. That's not to say that it's in a good state or the best state or the optimal state. It certainly isn't. But usually it's moving along. There's momentum and progress. But then something like a pandemic happens, and you have a buffoon like Trump leading, and I personally lost a lot of faith in society at that point. Not that I had a lot to begin with, but I am curious to what effect the pandemic has amplified these protests and riots.
When you were predicting riots, did you think they would be related, like directly related to the pandemic, or did you consider that it would be something else?
I definitely thought it would be something else. I don't know why somebody would riot over a pandemic.
Well, I mean, they didn't turn into riots, but there were protests for the lockdowns.
Yeah, lockdown protests, sure. The only way I could imagine the pandemic directly leading to rioting would be like if the lockdowns were enforced by like military action or something. Then I could see rioting.
Yeah.
But no, I was just thinking just basically the social contract would start to shred when people no longer have access to basic amenities and critical infrastructure systems start to falter, like things like power and water and such. The unemployment system has not been keeping up, so a lot of people are broke. So yeah, that's the stuff I was concerned about. Just generally, people would be less and less satisfied and more disrupted in their routines, and then pretty much anything can cause a riot at that point.
Something would kind of spark it.
Yeah. Now, it's possible this would be happening to some degree regardless of the pandemic. We can't really know that.
But you don't think it would be as bad?
No. Because, I mean, people have been locked in. They've been maltreated. They've lacked leadership entirely from this government. They've been
Lacked
going
resources.
broke. Yeah, lacked resources.
Lacked welfare.
Welfare, healthcare. I mean, the more poor among the population were barely getting by to begin with, and that equilibrium was brittle. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't enough there for any kind of safety net to function. So people get desperate. People are out of work. People are closed in, frustrated, online, watching viral videos of the police murdering people. That was caught on video, by the way. I forgot to mention that.
I think everyone's seen it by now.
Yeah. But those from the future might not know about this.
This will be in a time capsule.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if this show survives, it's possible that in like 20 years, some young whippersnapper will tune in and say, what's all this then? What's a pandemic?
I'm going to learn about history through Ciara and Kevin.
Right. What is civilization? That sounds nice.
What was civilization?
You know, I'm hesitant to use the word prediction. I don't think I predicted anything. But when this started a couple months ago, I started contemplating possibilities. And it's a lot of them have come to fruition.
Like what else?
Well, bank runs started around the time I started talking about them. Oddly, they stopped, and the stock market, I think, last I heard, is doing okay somehow. In fact, I think the somehow might be because the nation's billionaires have made, what was it, like $450 billion more dollars since the pandemic?
How?
I don't know. Investing in things. Yeah, I think I read that they increased their wealth by like, I can't remember the percentage, so I won't guess, but it was a huge, huge margin.
Just like 5 guys.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how. I think there's like 20 or something, 200, something with a 2, I bet. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's why the overall stock market is doing fine, because there's opportunists taking advantage and keeping it afloat, whether intentionally or not. But yeah, so
I've also heard that we're yet to see the effects on the stock market. Like it's too soon. Yeah,
I can imagine that. It's such a weird system because the whole stock market is not the whole thing, but most of it is a shared delusion. Mm-hmm. You know, it's
a lot of things are a shared delusion, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I mean, I
think the riots are kind of reflective of that.
Yeah, and I think a lot about. I always go back to fractional reserve banking because that's like one of the first places I was aware of this sort of phenomenon where in banking, for the most part, banks don't actually have your money. If 10 people deposit $100, they'll keep $200 and spend the rest of it on investments and loans and such. So that means that if everybody decided they want all their money at the same time and they go to withdraw it from the bank collapses, they don't get their money. A lot of it's insured federally, but I think only up to $100,000 per account. And then the banking system collapses. So usually on a small scale and temporarily, so far at least. But I'm coming to realize that a lot of our systems work that way. Like the phone system is fine for the most part, but not if everybody uses it at the same time. Then it collapses. You get busy signals or nothing. The internet's the same way. Bandwidth is great unless, like, if every single person in the world started streaming the same show at the same time, maybe not. Mm-hmm. Police, the same thing. Police, in a lot of places, there's nowhere near enough police to take care of a community, but definitely not once there's thousands of people in the streets burning down buildings.
Yeah.
And really, that everything that we take for granted in society is just a patchwork, a matrix of barely sufficient resources just tied together. Mm. So it's concerning that things are going the way they are. Not surprising.
Yeah.
And I hope that the worst of my, not predictions, but speculations don't come true.
Yeah.
Because the worst of it was civil war followed by a nuclear holocaust. And now there's talk of a civil war coming.
Yeah, it feels like it might be.
I hear it.
I mean,
I've just recently learned of something called the Boogaloo, mm-hmm. which conflicting reports say it's either that's a right-wing term or just an internet slang culture term.
I've heard it's a right-wing term.
Yeah, I don't know. But that's basically a slang for a theoretical upcoming civil war. And certainly there are people on the right and white supremacists who are using it a lot. Apparently the FBI is tracking some white supremacist groups who specifically wanted to use the George Floyd controversy and protests as a mask for creating chaos and sparking a race war and going out and starting looting and such.
All right, so let's talk about that, because it seemed to me that, first of all, when the riots first started, you and I kind of just spent 3 days watching riot porn. Like, I know I was just on Twitter just like, holy shit, and I couldn't keep my eyes off of it. And that's exactly what it is. It's riot porn. Like, it's horrible. I don't want it to be happening, but I can't look away. And I was noticing this narrative from, I would say, maybe my liberal friends, at least left-leaning friends, not all of them, but a lot, which was, you know, they were riot apologists, if that's a thing, or defending them, or sometimes even saying that riots work. Like, this is what we should be doing. This is the only thing that will lead to change because, you know, protests aren't enough. And I was pretty skeptical about that because it seemed very destructive to me, obviously, destroying communities, destroying a lot of times minority-owned, you know, businesses. I don't see how that, you know, helps. Or at the very least, you have to admit it's hurting a lot of people. And, it, you know, people have already died. There was a guy that was shot trying to loot a pawn shop. There was recently a retired cop, a black police, retired cop who got shot. So, you know, more people are going to die. It's going to devastate local economies, which is going to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people, which is usually minorities, or, you know, in large part minorities, I should say. So at least admit that that will happen. And then from there, you can try and maybe convince me and others that rioting is worth it. And I haven't seen that argument. But I did notice that there was this narrative of riots work, it's okay, it doesn't matter, it's just stuff, to white people started this. Right. And the white people is sometimes, like you said, it seems like people on the left are saying it's white supremacists, it's cops that are instigating it, people on the right, and then I would say center left, which is kind of where we are, blaming a lot of it on Antifa. It's kind of hard to pinpoint who or what Antifa is, you know, because it's not really a structured organization. But Portland is a hotspot for it. And last year we had tons of protests, and it was usually stuff like Proud Boys versus Antifa coming in. And they're not that hard to spot. Maybe I am being presumptuous, but they have a look, you know, like they look like they're usually just like young, white, dressed in black, usually have like anarchy patches, like that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I've talked to some people about it, and they have said like, well, there may be black bloc, but not Antifa.
Well, there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, there's tons of overlap there. So, the narrative went from riots work to white people started these riots. So, does that mean they're bad? Like, if they work, if they're good, does it matter who instigated it? Right. I don't understand the logic there, personally.
Yeah, and you know, the first day of the riots, I think it was the first day, that the Minneapolis mayor was saying that, I think he said that 80% of the rioters that they arrested were from out of state. Right. Which is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And all this speculation about who's starting it and who's doing it, it raises a lot of questions about motivations, because this is a weird situation where like both sides of the political spectrum, or all angles of the political circle, have some incentive to riot.
Yeah. So if you look at Antifa, their ideology is typically pretty far left, and there's a lot of like anarcho-communism type beliefs there. And you hear a lot of dismantle the system and smash the system type rhetoric. So it makes sense to me that they would have plenty of motivation to want to literally smash the system by smashing Target or whatever. So that makes perfect. I mean, I don't understand why they wouldn't be out there smashing things, you know? Yeah. And white supremacists, like, okay, yeah, they want to, they want to fan the flames of race wars, kind of almost want to do the same thing, like tear it down so they can rebuild in their vision.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they're like have different visions about like what they want the world to look like, they kind of want to do the same thing, which is destroy it and start again.
And the white supremacists may have a disingenuous motive to discredit the movement and gain support for right-wing politicians or get Trump reelected.
And that's another reason why I think riots are so bad. Is like most people looking at them, I mean, putting aside the people that work and live in those communities that they're destroying, people on the outside just looking at it, like most people think it's crazy. And yeah, it discredits it for sure. And on a larger scale, I think you and I have a disagreement about this, I think. I think it's going to get Trump reelected personally, because anyone that's, I think, defending the riots is probably going to be living in a city. They're going to be liberal or left-leaning, and those people aren't going to vote for Trump anyways. You know, for Biden to win, for a Democrat to win right now, he needs to, win the votes of people in the red states, which are typically red states. He needs to get those votes. He doesn't need to get the votes in the city. So, I don't know.
I think, though, that there's a couple things to consider. One is protests, at least, have occurred nationwide, and certainly the protests aren't the same as the riots, but they're related, and ostensibly, to whatever extent, they're joined by a common cause.
Mm-hmm.
So we can at least say that there's sentiment shared with the initial spark of the controversy, which is police brutality and racial tension.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, I think that the riots, I don't see the riots necessarily. I see your point, and I see how it could help Trump get reelected. Somebody made the point recently, I think it was the Blocked and Reported podcast I heard this morning, that made the point that the 1968 riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated didn't change the election outcome and maybe got Nixon reelected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good historical example of what you're talking about. What I think, though, is that the riots and everything else, it seems hard to... I can't really put myself in the mind of a Trump supporter. I can try, but I can't quite get there.
Sorry.
But it seems hard for... I would expect that even among the diehard Trump supporters, at this point, he is losing ground. And in fact, the polls show that he is losing ground. I think he's lost more than 10 points of approval in the last couple months. And it seems to be going steadily down.
Well, let me ask you this. So does that mean those are people saying that they won't vote for him, or that they just don't like
it's
him?
Just an approval rating. It's not a direct correlation with votes. And even
But I mean, what do they ask people exactly?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Do you approve of the president?
Well, that's the thing.
Well, it is things like, do you approve of the president's handling of a given situation or whatever?
Okay. So, I mean, it could be that people are like, yeah, I don't like the way he's handling this, but I'm not going to vote for Biden.
Yeah, but the point is that it's a downward trend. Whether it's on a large scale or small scale, one issue or several issues, it's pointing the correct direction, which is down. And he's making it worse. Thank God, the fucking idiot. God, I mean, I don't even know where to start. But just the other day, this was great. He had been getting some flack because apparently he spent a lot of time in his bunker at the White House when there was a lot of there were protests outside the White House that got kind of rowdy at times. And I don't personally fault him for being in his bunker. I don't even know if he had a choice. The Secret Service will tend to put you where they want you if you're... I know this because I watched The West Wing. They'll crash the White House if there's a perceived threat. Everybody stays where they are. The president gets whisked away somewhere if it's safe to do so.
Yeah, and there are mobs outside the White House. So.
Yeah. And I mean, mobs outside the White House, and nationally there were riots. So like they take all that into consideration and they do what they got to do. And I'm not going to blame the president for trying to stay safe.
Right.
But apparently... his ego took a bruising when those reports came out that he was hiding in a bunker instead of leading. So he went out and he decided he was going to go to, was it St. John's, I think, a local church that presidents are known for visiting. And so he had the police or whoever clear the crowd outside the White House with tear gas and marched down to the church with some top aides and advisors to wave a Bible around and say something about Jesus or whatever. Immediately afterward, the bishop of the church was outraged, making public comments that he was not invited, that this is a travesty, that he's basically insulting them and taking advantage of the church. They had visiting priests and the local parish were gassed in the crowd to clear the way for him to come and wave a Bible for the camera.
Oh my God.
And Pat Robertson came out against some of the shit he said, because that was right after he gave a speech saying that he's basically looking forward to sending in the military to break up these riots,
Right.
which is a no-no. And even Pat Robertson was like, look, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Like, fucking Pat Robertson, you know, the guy who thinks that the coronavirus came from cunnilingus. Fucking fundamentalist jackass. And then the Secretary of Defense, I forget his name at the moment, but he just came out, I think today, and said, we don't want to send in the military for this. This is not an appropriate use of the military. So he's going against the president. Several other top aides that were at that photo op with the Bible later said that they didn't even know that they had cleared the crowd with gas. That really backfired immediately.
Yeah.
Like his base is not happy with that. And granted, I'm seeing people defending it too. I saw one person saying, well, the bishop must have just lost their mind. They're just crazy to say facts, I guess. But my point is that I hope that Trump continues, now that the pressure is on and the spotlight is on, I really hope he continues making decisions for himself like that. Because maybe he didn't come up with that idea, but it seems like something he would do. Any political operative worth half a shit couldn't possibly conceive of that as a good PR stunt.
Yeah.
He's pissed off Christians. I mean, he used the police to clear a peaceful crowd to go do a photo op. Like that's a big deal.
Yeah.
By itself. So I'm hoping that as the basic systems continue to deteriorate and flounder, which is a bad thing, but it's happening because Donald Trump is the president, I'm hoping that draws enough attention that even setting aside the particulars, people can look at the state of the world now and 4 years ago, and there's not even the remotest chance of a question that things are worse.
Yeah.
On most issues we hadn't even thought of. They're just falling apart. So I'm hoping that awareness continues and Trump loses as much support as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so too. I hope you're right. I don't know. So if someone had told you that the pandemic wasn't like the worst thing that would happen in 2020, You've been like, yeah, that makes sense.
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, it depends on how you quantify things, because over 100,000 Americans have died, let alone the global toll.
Yeah, we're still going to wait and see. Like, this is a whole natural experiment with everyone out protesting.
Yeah.
You and I haven't gone out because there's still a pandemic.
Right. But we have seen a spike already in cases, specifically in Portland, where we are, or Oregon overall. There's been a spike, and more people are starting to die. We just recently had the youngest person die in Oregon from the coronavirus at 36 yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, our rates were pretty low.
Yeah.
Like, especially, I mean, compared to, I think, California and Washington, which were sandwiched between, like, they were a lot worse. Especially Seattle was such a hot spot for a minute. And considering we're right next to them, like, we were quite low before.
Yeah, we were doing pretty good.
Yeah.
And so that's spiking. You know, it is interesting because, like, when Trump was elected, I remember after like 6 months or a year, I was kind of surprised that the world wasn't on the brink of collapse. But I guess there's just a bit of a lag time.
Yeah.
Here we are. And I do blame a lot of this on Trump. To be fair, I can't blame all of it on Trump. And it would be hard to draw clear lines of cause and effect for various problems that we're seeing right now. But in general, the fashionable Republican managerial political style of deregulating things, slashing government, and expecting everybody to just work things out is a fucking catastrophe. And it always is. And, I mean, disbanding the pandemic task force certainly had a lot to do with what's happening here. Failing to fund the position for the overseer of Chinese pandemics specifically, or epidemics rather, Those sorts of things, like there's a reason we have those people in place.
Yeah.
And it's to stop things like this from happening. And they're in a tough spot often because there's a lot of roles in government and in civil society and everywhere else that when they're doing their job well, nobody notices because you don't have a pandemic. I mean, who knew that was a problem, you know? But then when you get rid of those people or you impair their ability to do their job, we have a pandemic. And, you know.
And here we are.
Government is an abstraction. It's something that took historical context and progress to put together. A lot of people have this impression that we can get rid of it. We can get rid of police. We can get rid of government, whatever. It's nonsense. We have these systems in place because we need to work together as a group. So we elect people to do things that scale for everyone, hopefully. It's imperfect. It's terrible at times. But it's the best that we've got. And people need to recognize that. People need to recognize that societies don't just work on their own. Mm-hmm. It takes effort and intelligence. There's a quote, I think it was Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And that's pretty much how I look at it. I'm not an idealist. I don't think that we have a great system, but compared to all the other ones we've tried throughout history, it is the best. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we got to get involved and make sure we don't have jackasses like Donald Trump at the helm, because this is what we get.
Yeah.
And we may not have seen the worst of this. I mean, it's happening now, you know. Mm-hmm. Things are unraveling.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you want to talk more about these protests and the narratives that's running it?
Sure.
Okay. So, as we mentioned before, and all you guys know, George Floyd was murdered by a cop. I don't think anyone argues that. I haven't seen it.
Well, actually, so this is one interesting footnote. The medical examiner, I think the official report finally came out. So there was some controversy when the preliminary report came out that said basically we're still looking at lab work and stuff, but there's no evidence of traumatic asphyxiation or strangulation. Which was interesting to me because when I watched the video, I also didn't see traumatic asphyxiation or strangulation. What I saw was positional and compressive asphyxiation and suffocation. So I don't know why the ME ruled out stuff that was obviously not happening, if you know your terminology. But now so there was a private pathologist hired to perform a private autopsy by the family, a famous one, Baden, I think. Mm-hmm. And he ruled what I said a few days prior, which is positional and compressive asphyxia caused by neck and back pressure. What's interesting is that the ME report came out shortly after that, and they both agree that it was homicide. But the ME report says that there were complicating factors and contributing factors like heart disease and some amount of fentanyl and methamphetamine in George Floyd's system. Whereas the private autopsy report is pulling no punches in saying he would be alive if not for what the cops did. The cops murdered him. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of gray area, but both reports say it was homicide. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I got the impression that the first ME, I don't really know exactly, like, if you're an ME, to say it's homicide sounds like a legal term rather than a medical term.
Yeah, so what I saw was the second report I saw said that the cause of death was asphyxiation and the manner of death was homicide. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the details either, but I think they probably throw that in when they know, based on either evidence like a bullet hole,
right,
or a video of somebody being suffocated. It's more of a, because homicide is well, yeah, I mean there are semantic gray areas too, because homicide, the way I've seen it explained in these recent reports, is death at the hands, a human's death at the hands of another human. But then is an execution homicide if it's state sanctioned? Right. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know how all the words work, but basically both reports are saying that he was killed by people.
Yeah. And I think the first ME is getting a lot of flack right now.
Rightly
People
so.
are I suppose, but I guess your point is they don't contradict each other in the way people think they do.
Yeah, they don't. Right. Yeah. The first one definitely is a little sketchy and vague. And it says that he had a heart attack, which the private report didn't find any evidence of. Mm. But even the medical examiner report that said there was a heart attack said he was still killed by the cops. So basically they agree.
Yeah, but the first one was misleading and ruling out something that wasn't.
It was misleading or just really, really hacky. Like just amateurish if they didn't even actually know the difference. I mean, either way, it's really fucked up. Either they didn't know which words they were supposed to use,
right,
which is bad for a medical examiner, or they deliberately used the wrong words just to create confusion and misdirection.
Yeah.
So, anyway, but back to your point. I think I haven't seen anybody really saying that wasn't murder.
Yeah. So it's this horrible thing that happened. And I think everyone agrees with that. Like it's fucking horrible. The cops are arrested, they're charged, but people are still protesting and rioting. And it seems to be because people think that this case was reflective of a systemic issue of racial bias in the police force. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And, we see a lot of these cases in the news a lot. And I mean, some weird shit just happened before George Floyd was murdered. It wasn't necessarily related to police, but like just instances of what looks like shitty people being racist. So there was the, less consequential case of the Amy Cooper, the woman in the park who called the police on the bird watcher. That was pretty crazy. No one died, thankfully. No one got hurt. But then just before that, there was... I can't think of his name, but the guy that got shot by redneck vigilantes who thought he was breaking into houses.
I think it was Arbery, something like that.
Yeah. And that looks pretty bad.
They thought he looked like a suspect who had done something, and they shot him.
Yeah. So we hear these cases in the news, and it does paint a picture of, there's some terrible racism in our country. And racism exists. I would never, ever refute that. It does exist. And this is like an awkward thing to bring up because it's always awkward to, when there's such an emotionally charged story, like leading this narrative, like George Floyd just dying under a guy's knee, it's hard to then be like, well, let's look at the data, because data is cold and heartless. But it's important to look at the data if you're making claims.
And you mean data about whether or not there's a pattern currently of police killing black men in disproportionate numbers.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I guess you can look at it in different ways. Like that, is there an epidemic of white cops killing black cops?
Right.
Unarmed black men getting killed, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and white cops killing black suspects, that's an important point too, because a lot of times stories will gain steam based on whatever is the most controversial angle, despite reality. Mm-hmm. I think it was the Freddie Gray case about 4 years ago in Baltimore, where there was a Freddie Gray was killed by the police. He was handcuffed and put in the back of a police wagon, and then they drove around like crazy. Apparently that's called a rough ride in police lingo, just to like bang him up, and he broke his neck in the process. So they murdered that guy.
Yeah. But
3 of the 5 cops were black. The majority of that police department is black. What you saw there was a case of police brutality.
Yeah.
And it was not racially motivated, but you can bet that the headlines made it racially motivated.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing where we're talking about statistics.
Yeah. And that, things aren't as black and white as they seem.
Right.
Sorry, that was corny.
That was pretty cool.
Well, all right. So let's give an example of one of these statistics. So I believe like in 2005, the number of unarmed black men that were shot and killed in the U.S.
by
the police was in the hundreds.
Wow.
Last year, it was 9. And it's gone down every year since then. This wasn't just a fluke year last year.
Yeah. And there were, in the same year, 19 white unarmed men killed by the police.
Yeah.
Granted, there's a difference in population sizes, but considering that the police are actually more likely to interact with black populations based on population size, that's interesting. That more than twice as many unarmed white men were killed by the police as black men.
Right.
And again, we can't draw any conclusions from that by itself because we would need a full analysis of all the various factors and trend data and populations and everything else. But it, I think, would surprise a lot of people to know that.
Yeah.
There seems to be this perception that white cops are out there murdering black men left and right, which certainly has been the case in the past. I mean, there were times in America's past when cops were literally lynching black men, not arresting them, not putting them on trial, finding them based on rumor or just shared hatred and killing them in public in front of crowds.
Yeah.
So nobody's denying that.
No.
But that's not what's happening now.
Yeah. And people often point out that black men are disproportionately arrested and deal with the cops compared to the white population. So there's something like 13% of the U.S. is black. And I think like twice as much is...
twice the percentage.
Get arrested by cops or have to deal with the cops and that sort of thing. And this is where it gets kind of dicey. But if you think it through, you're still going to come to like a point of, oh, this is a problem of racism, but it's not the narrative that I think is being run, is pushing these protests. So the reason that black, when you control for crime statistics or crime statistics, the racial bias disappears. So
I don't know that it completely disappears. But it's kind of like the wage gap with men and women, where there is some systemic bias and individual bias in the system, but there's also a lot of mythology around it.
Yeah.
The data, it's been 4 years ish since I looked at the data. I think it was the Freddie Gray case when I actually analyzed the information. And when I looked at the data from local police departments and county sheriff's offices and the FBI and kind of collated it all together, they pretty much agreed that there were more interactions between police and black Americans than you would expect based purely on population, and the numbers agreed that black communities experience more crime.
Right.
And the conclusion, well, there wasn't conclusion in the data, but the implication was that at the very least, some of the increased interactions are because there is more crime.
Right.
And some people refute that. There are people who say there's not more crime in black American communities on average. And I think they refute that because what they hear when you say that is black people are prone to commit crime.
Right, because they're black.
Right. And that is not the case.
No.
Poverty causes crime.
Right.
And black Americans are more likely to be in poverty because of centuries of systemic racism.
Exactly.
So it's kind of, a lot of people end up chasing their own tail because they're arguing that essentially years of systemic racism didn't lead to more crime in contemporary American black communities, and that the poverty they experience as a result of that systemic racism isn't diminishing their quality of life. And crime rates is a direct indicator of quality of life. So there's a lot of well-meaning liberals who go through some mental hoops to avoid saying that black Americans are more likely to commit crime and be the victim of crime. Yeah.
And so my point is, like, there is a problem of racism. I think it's more a problem to do with our history of racism than racism today. If you enslave a group of people and exploit them and then put them through Jim Crow laws and redlining, it's going to take them a while. Like, they're not going to come out of that equal to the people that enslaved them. Like, it's going to take some generations for them to, fare as well as someone who's experiencing, like, generational wealth. And I was reading this really good article by Coleman Hughes called it's like the case for optimism.
The case for black optimism.
The case for black optimism. And he said something really interesting, which is people look at things in two different lenses. You can look at it through a gap lens, kind of like what you were saying, where you're comparing black Americans to white Americans and like looking at the gap and saying like, wow, they're incarcerated more, wow, they're, dying of heart disease more often, or they're more poor. Or you can look at it through a past lens to see if they've improved from the past. And in almost every indication of like well-being that you can think of, Black Americans are improving. It's just that when you compare them to white Americans, there's a gap.
Right.
And he made a good point where, imagine you could push a button where you would double like everything like good in terms of well-being for both blacks and whites and cut everything that's bad in half. And no matter how many times you push that button, no matter how much progress you make, there'll still be a gap.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know exactly what to do about that, but I think that we need to at least recognize that we have made huge improvements and we're still improving. And I just keep hearing this narrative of nothing's changed. There's this white supremacy that is infused in all of us, and that's what to blame for everything. And I don't see it that way. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I that's one that really frustrates me every time I see it, when somebody says nothing has changed. Like, how fucking dare you?
Yeah.
I mean, that's so incredibly out of touch.
Right.
Granted, maybe I shouldn't be offended by it. It's just people who lack information.
What is that saying? Like, Martin Luther King didn't do anything?
Right. I mean, we've come a long way.
Yeah, and we have been improving.
Yeah. I think this what you're describing, what I think makes it hard for people to see things that way, whether consciously or not, is because it can leave you feeling kind of helpless, because I think the answer is, what do we do? More steady progress. Mm-hmm. And at times revolutionary progress, but overall progress is a sustained effort. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah. And
people don't want to hear that. They want justice now. They want to do something. People feel guilty for not doing more. They get worked up.
Well, and I don't think we should all just sit on our hands and wait and just be like, oh, it's just a matter of time. There are things we can do, but I don't think, I mean, I'm sure there's ways the police can improve. Like, absolutely. Yeah. Like there's
I mean, Chicago, one of the things that I was speculating is that there's going to be wide scale retraining about asphyxiation death. And within like 2 days, the Chicago chief of police, I think it was the chief, had declared that every single cop under his command was going to go through extensive positional asphyxia training and be required to watch that video in class.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And granted, that's not going to change the whole system and fix the world, but that is how it works. Mm-hmm. And granted, they should have known this shit ahead of time, and hopefully they've been trained before. But anyway, yeah, back to you.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I'm all for making police better, because they can be assholes and they can do stupid shit. If you want to address, issues in the Black community and their problems, I think you need to look at it more holistically and look at things like access to education, like access to birth control, access to health care, access to, like, a lot of these communities are food deserts, meaning they don't have easy access to fresh, healthy food, that sort of thing. That's what's going to improve the lives and the prosperity of Black America. If you want to do, work on police reform, that's great, but that doesn't address what I think are, issues of racism in society, or the effects of racism in society.
Yeah. And I mean, and just to reiterate, I know we've said this already, but there are also racist cops. There are cops who are just bad people in general, indiscriminate bad people who just like victimizing vulnerable individuals in society, and they do so. And then there are racist cops who are like that as well. And what we're talking about is just that the popular perception at the moment seems to be a simplified version of a matrix of negative influences, and simply focusing on one aspect. Granted, I can't speak for protesters or rioters. I don't mean to imply that they're only focusing on one aspect. But I think you and I have a perception of a lot of this based on social media and the news. And I know that what I'm seeing is a mix. It's a mix of some really good illustrations through video and testimony of police brutality, evidence for the need for reform and such. but then that's mixed in with a bunch of nonsense, various kinds of nonsense, whether it's misinformation or just lies or confusion. And I think that's because people are trying to pigeonhole this issue into a hole it just doesn't fit into.
Yeah. And it's creating tension between people that doesn't need to be there. I'm just a strong believer that if you want to solve a problem, you got to be honest about it first. And it's hard to be honest about this because it's like what we're saying is going against what on social media and just listening to my friends talk, what the narrative is.
Yeah. And I have some things to say about that. And I'm a little hesitant to say them because I don't mean to target people who mean well in things that they're saying and doing, a lot of whom are my friends. But I disagree with a lot of it. And so I do feel an obligation, like you said, to be honest. And some of the things I'm seeing that I think are really hurting the situation, I think the worst one is various prescriptive normative instructions. So a lot of friends and acquaintances I see posting things like, here's what you should say, here's what you shouldn't say. If you're white, shut up and listen, or if you're white, speak more because you've been too quiet. Silence is compliance.
Yeah, white silence is violence, but also shut up.
Yeah. And I mean, a good friend of mine, I won't name any names, but a good friend of mine posted about muting herself for a while to help, bring
Make
visibility
room
for the black speakers. And in the same post had a quote that silence is compliance. And you could make a case that, well, that means like silence in the sense of like not doing anything, not silence in the sense of shutting up to make room. But then that's getting in the weeds. Mm-hmm. What matters, I think, is not the protocol for how you share your support for the cause. It's that you do it. And if you don't do it, that's okay too, because silence actually is not racism. There's a lot of people saying silence is racism and words are violence and that kind of shit. But you know what's racism? Racism is racism.
Yeah.
It's really... So let's talk about the black squares.
Okay.
So a couple days ago, was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's yesterday.
It was Blackout Tuesday, where people were just posting black squares on Instagram, taking a day off.
This just cracks me up, this old thing.
So the idea was actually launched by Atlantic Records, and it was for the music industry to stop self-promoting and just promote like black music for like a day, and fine, whatever. But then it kind of took off as celebrities were endorsing it and random people, and it became just like everybody should just post a black square on Instagram and hashtag it. And that's where it became a problem. So the hashtag originally, I think, was Blackout Tuesday, but then a lot of people were hashtagging it with Black Lives Matter. And then Black Lives Matter organizers and activists were like, hey, we use social media to coordinate and share information, and all we're getting is fucking millions of black squares now. There's no real-time updates.
Like a big censorship campaign.
Yeah. You can't see the work that's being done. You can't see who needs help or where to go for what information. This is an absolute clusterfuck. So they were like, all right, we need to remove the Black Lives Matter hashtag and keep Black Tuesday. And then other people came out and were like, you know what? This is stupid to begin with because we have the most momentum we've ever had right now for the cause. And so you're taking a knee and taking a day of silence when the whole world is focused on the cause? That's a terrible idea. Keep talking.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, white people are just like, whoa, what? Do I shut up? Do I say more? What hashtag do I do? Is it a black square or what? Maybe a gray square is better? Is it just on Facebook but not Instagram? And this is... This is the part where I think the answer to this is maybe just stop signaling.
Yeah.
Just slow down with signaling. I think signaling can be good. One of our listeners linked me to an article that I have to confess I didn't read, but it was in defense of virtue signaling, and I didn't read it because I actually defend virtue signaling to a degree. Because there are times when it's ambiguous how many people support something, or if it's unpopular to support something but it's still important. Then, yeah, that's a good time to signal that you do actually support something. But I think it's jumped the shark in this case. I mean, we've got people who are desperate to show that they're on the right side and to do some kind of good, but they're fucking things up. And I think a lot of it, I tried to do a little simulation and put myself in the mind of like, a typical white person posting a black square, and which I almost did, by the way. I was like right on the verge of doing it because I woke up and I was like, oh, this is inspiring. It's like all these black squares. It's great. I want to join in on that. And I was like, well, let me Google it first and see what the fuck this is. And the first article I found was like, you shouldn't do this. Anyway, so I'm certainly not. I mean, I would be a hypocrite if I said that I'm immune to this sort of influence. But anyway, so I did this little experiment in my head where I was trying to imagine what it's like to be in that position. Like, oh shit, I did the wrong type of signal. Let me adjust it 3 times. And I think what's going on is that a lot of people, and I'm specifically thinking about like white people. I think it's easier for me to imagine being a white person since I am one. But I think a lot of them are in this position where they're being told things like silence is violence, and they're being told that they're unconsciously racist and that they have to go out of their way to be allies and activists. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're affected by that, as they should be, because they're not racist and they don't want to be racist, and to their knowledge they weren't. But then they're in this position of trying to solve their own racism that frankly doesn't exist in a lot of cases. And that leads them to just kind of do what people are telling them to do. Interestingly, it's often their white friends telling them what to do. Yeah. Like I've seen a lot of my white friends telling white people what to do. Haven't seen a single black friend telling white people what to do.
Yeah, I haven't either. Which
is interesting. One friend of mine, again, I hate to, I'm not going to name names, but I still feel bad calling out well-meaning friends. But one of my friends posted, it was something like, "Dear white people, either just say Black Lives Matter or shut the fuck up." And what's interesting about that is, first of all, I disagree with the sentiment. Secondly, he's white, and he's not saying just Black Lives Matter. He's starting an argument.
Right.
Like he's not even following his own stupid advice. And the other thing is, I think maybe if the issue that we're talking about is race and equality, maybe it's not the best approach to start by addressing people by race and instructing them by race. Maybe that's not the right way to go. I'm just saying. Mm-hmm. So you've got people experiencing white guilt, some of which is deserved, and frantically trying to do the right thing, but they're doing it they're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. It's not their racism that's the problem. And it's kind of like an inversion of Kant's categorical imperative. In ethical philosophy, that was this idea that in any situation, if you don't know what's the ethical thing to do, just do what you would want everybody else to do if they were in the same situation. And I think what I'm seeing here is kind of an inversion of that, where people are instead saying that they want everybody in the same situation to do whatever they're doing. And I think that's because of this weird cognitive blind spot people have when they're convinced that they're racist by nature, kind of like the biblical original sin, that no matter what they do, they're racial sinners. And so they have to just maniacally, frantically signal that they're trying to do better. And then everybody else needs to do it too, because if they don't, then they're helping the original sin of being white in a lot of cases. And it just leads to nonsense. And it's not productive, and it's exclusive, or exclusionary rather. It's blocking people out of the conversation.
It's just causing more division.
Yeah. Signaling is fine if it's simple and it's not according to a protocol. If you have to post a black square with or without a special hashtag, you're going down the wrong road. Mm-hmm. Because social media is contained by certain elements. There's only so many parameters in social media, and social media is so ubiquitous that people do use it for actual causes. And you could say that signaling your support of something is a cause, but there's a difference between lip service and support. And when you have lip service, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But heavily regimented lip service is bad.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hilarious to watch. People are like, "Oh, I got the black square. Oh, wait. Shit. Wrong hashtag. I'm going to delete and repost. Got a better hashtag now. Oh, shit. This is bad too? Because I'm supposed to be talking more? But wait, I'm white. I thought I was supposed to shut up.
I see.
Let me call my black friends, ask them what to do." I saw a post that said, one thing you can do if you're white, if you have black friends, reach out, offer support for them. If they're just acquaintances, you don't know them that well, send them $5.
Seems very patronizing to me.
Yeah. And then if you don't have any black friends, you're the problem. That's what this fucking post said. And this was posted by somebody I love dearly, a very good friend of mine, and I respect her. But that's a fucking bad message, start to finish.
Oh, God. All of this, I feel like, just comes to intersectionality and identity politics that is just a dead-end poison that is not, like, people, like, I feel like it's just kind of, like, they poison the water stream, and people are just kind of taking these empty, messages and exchanging these memes and pushing this narrative and just blindly accepting it as this is the way things are. And it's different than they see it, I think. I'm not seeing what they're seing. And
yeah.
and it's hard to talk about it. I just kind of avoid engaging with like a lot of my friends, except I've kind of been reaching out lately to my friends, just asking them questions, kind of see where they're at, but I try to keep my opinions to myself because it's just so easy to, be branded as a bigot if you're not abiding by this narrative and playing these games.
Yeah, not to mention that these games change every day.
Yeah.
Multiple times a day in some cases.
Yeah.
The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which I've mentioned a couple times, who maintain the doomsday clock, tracking essentially the likelihood of world-ending cataclysm caused by humans. One of the areas they track, they track three key ones. They started with nuclear war. That's what they still focus on, nuclear weapons. Then climate change. And then the third one is disruptive technology. They are of the opinion that poor information quality caused by social media and other internet technologies is one of the greatest existential threats to humanity. And I think that we're seeing a lot of illustration of that point. We're seeing the evidence. You've got this disruptive technology of social media that allows virality, and it allows people to engage in groupthink at a rate and on a scale that is historically unprecedented. Normally, people would be able to fall into check at some point before reaching millions into a given cause. Like when I was checking these hashtags, there were 2.3 million at the time of Blackout Tuesday posts. That kind of thing can only happen because of disruptive technology. And I don't have a solution for it, but it's risky, and people need to at least be aware that they are being bought and sold by companies that profit from divisiveness. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article that quoted an internal Facebook memo saying that their algorithms exploit divisiveness, and I think the context was that they considered it a problem. They didn't want to do that, but they never fixed it. It was years ago. They're still doing it, and we're affected by that. We're affected by that emotionally and psychologically and socially, and we contribute to it as well.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes down to it, like what happened to George Floyd, as horrible as it was, is incredibly rare and is not reflective of a systematic problem of racism in the police force. And maybe there'll be some good that comes of it. Like maybe we'll solve problems by going about it the wrong way. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just hard
we
when...
always do.
Yeah. It's just so, hard to watch our economy get destroyed by a pandemic and then further destroyed by anarchists or white supremacists or whatever. People just actively destroying it. I think this is just causing so much more harm than it will cause good, and it's like the story isn't even right.
Yeah. And in LA, where a lot of the rioting happened, it was the weekend of reopening after the pandemic. This was like, let's restart the economy and try our best to mitigate the disaster. And the next thing you know, people's businesses are on fire. The fire department was spread so thin they couldn't even perform the standard firefighting protocols because they didn't have enough staff, because they're just having to let fires burn. Yeah. And that's not the right way to go.
And another thing people I don't think about is the police are spread so thin right now. There's going to be other opportunists that are going to break into houses and rape people and take advantage of that, knowing that the police can't come for you.
Yeah. By the way, if any of our listeners are among the abolish the police crowd, please write in and explain how that works and what happens next. I want to know. And I there is a little attitude in my voice, I will admit that, because I'm skeptical. But I really do want to know if somebody actually has something resembling a cogent case for getting rid of the police. I'd love to hear it. Yeah,
there's something called, I think it's the Ferguson effect, where, when these stories come out, like with, for instance, George Floyd or any other instances where a cop kills a black man, and it gets caught on tape, you can imagine that whatever you think of Chauvin, I hope it's bad things because he's a bad person. I think we can all agree no one wants to be Chauvin right now. Like, that's not a fun place to be.
Right.
So what do you think is going to happen when these stories come out and cops are being demonized and, you know, there's all this uproar? What happens is cops don't want to go into black neighborhoods.
Right.
And so what happens then is crime spikes and it just gets worse in those neighborhoods.
And I mean, there is a distinction to be made with like cases that are misrepresented as excessive force versus this case, which was excessive force. So hopefully that applies less in this case because most cops actually aren't out there murdering people.
Right.
So, you know, but there are cases. There was a case a few years ago where I can't remember all the details. I believe it was a black man at a convenience store selling CDs was the story, and I won't get into all the details of that, but my analysis of it showed that the cops acted the way they should. They killed him. He drew a gun on them. There were a lot of details not reported in the press. It was presented as a police brutality case and the murder of a black man by white police and some kind of racist whatever. It wasn't that. And that's the kind of thing where I'll bet the police lost a lot of their force because they see the media painting them as bad guys, even when they're not. Mm-hmm. And in this case, you know, Chauvin was the bad guy, and
yes,
and
absolutely.
the three officers were complicit.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for making that point. I just mean that I think a lot of cops have this feeling of like, I don't even want to deal with black people because God forbid I do get an altercation
or
and
white
it's a
people
little complicated.
Now, you know, like
what?
Because there's so many well-meaning leftist white people causing a lot of these problems. You know, like the "all cops are bastards" hashtag ACAB. I don't know where that started, but you know, like
it was a rap song.
Oh yeah, I see a lot of anti-police sentiment being spread that is not necessarily coming from the same communities that are affected by police violence, because I think anybody who interacts with the police a lot, there are exceptions, but I think a lot of the time, at least, they know that there's good and bad cops, and they know that, in theory at least, cops are a good thing for a society. They want reform. They don't want to get rid of the cops. Because, I mean, the other thing about living in a poor neighborhood is that it's not just the cops you have to worry about. It's your fucking neighbors.
Right.
Like, I've lived in poor neighborhoods, and I've observed what happens in countries that don't have effective police forces. They're run by the mafia. Mm-hmm. It's various forms of organized crime. It's one or the other. And you can't really reform organized crime. Try to reform a cartel. Do they listen to your vote? Do they give you a ballot? No, they don't. So, yeah, my point being that I think a lot of the people most affected by the police are probably not the ones calling to abolish the police. I think that comes from a place of privilege.
Yes, I agree. And it's a similar sentiment about the rioting, which is, I haven't looked these polls, but like Coleman Hughes said that like in the past, when you poll residents of a community that got rioted to see how they felt about the riots, a majority of them aren't happy about it.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah. Why would they be?
Yeah. All right, let's wrap this up.
All right.
So, I'm optimistic.
Are you?
Yeah.
Why? Give us a reason to be optimistic.
Because overall, throughout history, there have been a lot of bad things happen, most of which were chronic and ongoing, some of which were cataclysmic and sudden. But overall, things have continually gotten better. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue that way, particularly when you have disruptive scale issues like technology and nuclear weapons that are like just unprecedented historically. I mean, you can bet that if there were nuclear weapons during medieval times, we wouldn't be here today. So, you know, things could continually get worse, and you know, it could be the end of society, or at least a regression of society and cultural values. But I do have some faith in people. And I think that despite all the problems and mistakes of various stripe, hopefully we'll keep moving in the right direction.
All right. We'll leave it at that.
Was that convincing?
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. Send us your questions at standardpodcast.com. And, yeah.
Stay safe.
Howdy.